Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor for History and Systems of Psychology, and we are into almost the end of this course. हम लेक्चर नंबर 42 पे पहुंच गए हैं और आपको अब उम्मीद रखता हूं कि नफ्सियात के इर्तिका का काफ़ी इल्म और उसके बारे में काफ़ी आपकी आगाही हो चुकी होगी। अब हम शुरू हुए थे इस कोर्स में, आपको याद है, ज़माना कदीम से, दैट इज़ बिफोर क्राइस्ट, कबल अज़ मसीह से, और हम ले आए थे साइकोलॉजी की डेवलपमेंट को, इसके इर्तिका को सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर तक, और 20वीं सदी की 5वीं और 4थी दिहाई का हमने जिक्र शुरू किया था। और मैंने ये बताया था कि हम अब जिसको तीसरी दुनिया कहते हैं उसमें जो साइकोलॉजी या नफ्सियात का असर, रसूख और इर्तिका या डेवलपमेंट हुई है, उसके क्या खदोखाल थे। आज भी कुछ उसी टॉपिक से मुतल्लिक हम बात करेंगे और देखेंगे कि कुछ और ममालिक में, जिनको हम तीसरी दुनिया के ममालिक कहते हैं, उनमें नफ्सियात की क्या कैसे डेवलपमेंट हुई, क्या क्या उसके खदोखाल थे, और अब मौजूदा दौर में क्या उसके खदोखाल और हैसियत है। इससे पहले कि हम कुछ और नौ आज़ाद ममालिक में नफ्सियात का जिक्र करें, लेट अस टेक ए लुक एट व्हाट वी हैड डन इन लेक्चर नंबर 41, दैट इज़ द प्रीवियस लेक्चर. Let us review. In relation to that review, let me refresh your mind as to what is psychology in the third world. Third world, if you remember, is called that region or those areas of the world which became autonomous or independent after the Second World War. दूसरी जंग अज़ीम के बाद जो ममालिक आज़ाद हुए, जिन्होंने ख़ुद मुख्तारी हासिल की, उनको हम तीसरी दुनिया के मुल्क कहते हैं, जिनमें हमारा मुल्क बर सग़ीर में इंडिया, पाकिस्तान, बांग्लादेश ये थे। इसके अलावा आप जानते हैं अफ़्रीका के बहुत से ममालिक थे। इसके अलावा आप ये भी जानते हैं कि वियतनाम और इंडोनेशिया भी ये ऐसे ही मुल्क थे जो दूसरी जंग अज़ीम के बाद आज़ाद हुए। और इसमें सबसे बड़ा, सबसे अजीम मुल्क जो था, नौ आबादियात में दूसरी जंग अज़ीम में जो दूसरी जंग अज़ीम के बाद जो आज़ाद हुआ, वो जिसको हम पीपल्स रिपब्लिक ऑफ चाइना या आजकल हम चीन कहते हैं, अवामी जमहूरिया चीन जिसको कहते हैं, ये बहुत बड़े बड़े ममालिक थे और इनसे मुतल्लिक हमने नफ्सियात का मुतालिया किया था। और इस रेफरेंस में हमने देखा था कि एक अफ्रीकी माहिर नफ्सियात यानी अल्जीरिया का रहने वाला बाय द नेम ऑफ फ्रांज फैनॉन, what were his ideas and views related to psychology? And if you recall, and I will refresh your memory on this, that he had talked about that as a result of colonization, नौ आबादियात बनने की वजह से उसके ख्याल में दो किस्म की नफ्सियात ने जन्म लिया था, the one psychology of the colonizer and the other the psychology of the colonized. जैसे युंग जो है वो दो किस्म के लोगों की तफरीक करता है। He says there are the introverts and the extroverts, if you remember. इसी तरह से फ्रांस फैनॉन भी जो है वो कहता है there are two types of people in the newly emerging states that became independent after the Second World War, and those two types of people, one is what he calls the colonizer, वो जो नौआबादियाती हुक्मरान थे, and the colonized, वो जो लोकल लोग थे. और वो फैनॉन का ये ख्याल था, आपको याद होगा, कि इन दोनों लोगों की नफ्सियात जो है वो मुख्तलिफ किस्म की है और इन्हीं को हमें मुताला करना चाहिए. और आपको याद है कि उसने कहा था that the colonizer considers himself superior and the aggressor, and the colonized considers himself meek, weak and inferior. The colonizer considers his own culture, the culture of the colonizer, the French or the American or the British or the Dutch cultures, whoever colonized those areas, they considered their own culture to be superior and the culture of the colonized to be inferior. और इसमें problematic बात ये थी कि जो फैनॉन के ख्याल में those people who were colonized tended to agree with the division that was created by the colonizer. Fanon had put forward the view that this superiority-inferiority division of the colonizer and the colonized gave rise to rage. बहुत लोगों में गुस्सा पाया जाता था और वो गुस्सा जो है फैनॉन के ख्याल में that the colonizer used to further his own interest by diverting that rage not against the proper source of the rage, which was the colonizer and the colonizer's policies, but against religious sects, against tribal belongingness, against languages, against cultural differences, against ethnic differences. इसलिए colonizer जो है फैनॉन के ख्याल में वो अपनी हुकूमत चलाने में या एक डिवीजन पैदा करने में कामयाब रहता है जब तक वो अपने खिलाफ कॉलोनाइज्ड के गुस्से को इस तरह का रंग न दे ले और उसको मुख्तलिफ अंदाज में न पेश करे. एंड दैट वाज इन फैनॉन्स पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू one of the main sources of the psychological makeup and the psychological disease in the places that he called the colonized countries. This adoption, according to Fanon, of accepting the superiority of the colonizer and accepting the inferiority of the colonized and considering the colonizer's culture to be superior and considering the colonized culture to be inferior, what was called by Fanon the colonial mentality. Colonial mentality to him was acceptance of the colonizer's way of thinking by the colonized people. And this rage and colonial mentality, in Fanon's point of view, who was an Algerian psychiatrist, if you remember. Do you know where Algeria is? One of the independent countries in Africa now. One of the important variables of the in determining mental disease in Fanon's point of view was the acceptance of colonial mentality, and the other important variable in determining the mental disease in the people in the colonized areas, according to Fanon, was the rage, गुस्सा जो colonizer महसूस करता है, जो वो शख्स जो गुलाम बनाया गया नौआबादियात मुल्कों का, वो गुस्सा जो महसूस करता है. ये दोनों चीज़ें फैनॉन के ख्याल में colonial mentality and the rage were the main sources of mental ill health in the people in the third world countries. So his methodology, Fanon suggested, his methodology was that people should realize the true source of their rage, and people should realize the true meaning of colonial mentality, and then get involved in directing the rage where it should be directed against the colonizer and rid themselves of colonial mentality, that is, to regard their own culture, language, and selves to be inferior, ridding themselves from these things and directing the rage that they feel as a result of being colonized against the colonizer, were in Fanon's point of view the methods of treatment. और फैनॉन, आपको याद है, उन्होंने अपने तजुर्बात और अपने मुशाहिदात की बुनियाद पर ये देखा था कि वो लोग जो अल्जीरिया में कॉलोनाइज़र के ख़िलाफ़ जंग में हिस्सा लेने लगे, उनके ज़हनी मसाइल भी हल होते चले गए. और ये भी आपको याद होगा कि फैनॉन का ये भी कहना था दैट war is not only fought by guns and cannons. Wars can also be fought by pen and by word of mouth and by one's action and in the sports field and in the classrooms and in the operation theaters and on the stage. So all of these things are suggested by Fanon to rid people of their mental illnesses, which in his point of view were due to colonial mentality. This is one important contribution coming from the third world countries in the development of psychology. The concepts of rage, the concepts of colonizer and the colonized, and the concept of colonial mentality, and the ridding of people's mental problems by becoming a part of liberators from the colonizers. चलिए कुछ और भी तीसरी दुनिया से मुतल्लिक ममालिक में नफ्सियात जो है उसका मुताला करते हैं. और इसमें एक अहम मुल्क जो है वो है पीपल्स रिपब्लिक ऑफ चाइना, जिसको हम अवामी जमहूरिया चीन भी कहते हैं. आप जानते हैं अवामी जमहूरिया चीन जो है, पीपल्स रिपब्लिक ऑफ चाइना बिकेम इंडिपेंडेंट और overthrew the influence of the colonizers in 1949. उससे पहले चीन में बहुत से मुल्कों का बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग असर और रसूख था, जिसमें सर फहरिस्त अमेरिका था, जिसमें दूसरे ममालिक भी शामिल थे, जैसा कि इंग्लिस्तान, जैसा कि फ्रांस, जैसा कि जापान. ये चार जो मुल्क थे, इनका बहुत गहरा असर और रसूख था चाइना पर. और 1949 में 1949 में अंडर द गाइडेंस एंड लीडरशिप ऑफ चेयरमैन माओ ज़ेडुंग, द कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी ऑफ चाइना gained control over the state of China and turned China into an independent state called the People's Republic of China. तो नफ्सियात जो चीन में हम देखेंगे, उसके दो आपको पहलू देखने हैं. मुख्तसरन, आप अभी अंडर ग्रेजुएट स्टेज पर हैं, इसलिए मुख्तसरन आपसे गुजारिश करूंगा. उसके दो पहलू थे. एक, बिफोर चाइना बिकेम independent of the colonial powers, that is in 1949, and after China became independent from the colonial powers after 1949. पहले मुख्तसरन जिक्र कर लेते हैं 20वीं सदी के शुरू का, जिसमें चाइना जो है that was under the yoke of, although there was no direct control of any government over China, but there was tremendous influence of the colonial powers over China in the opening years of the 20th century. In 1919 और 1920 के दरमियान बहुत से अमरीकी माहिरीन नफ्सियात जो हैं वो चाइना में गए और उन्होंने अपना सिस्टम जो है वो सेटअप किया. इनमें जो मशहूर माहिरीन नफ्सियात थे वो उनके मुतल्लिक आप भी पढ़ चुके हैं. एक मशहूर माहिर नफ्सियात थे विलियम जेम्स. इनका असर और रसूख बहुत गहरा था चाइना में. इनकी किताबों को ट्रांसलेट किया गया चाइनीज़ में और इनकी किताबों को चाइनीज़ यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में पढ़ाया जा रहा था। आप जानते हैं विलियम जेम्स, हमने जब when we were talking about earlier parts of development of psychology, we had talked about a school called functionalism. Do you remember what that school was? Functionalism in the American continent owed its origin, if you remember, to that very prominent psychologist William James. And if you remember, William James had defined psychology as a science of consciousness, and he put forward the view that we should study the functions of consciousness. What function consciousness plays in the psychology of an individual, that was the main thrust of the thought put forward by William James. यही influence, यही किताबें, and if you remember also, he wrote that famous book by the name of Principles of Psychology, in which he had defined consciousness as a stream. And he had put forward the view, if you remember we talked about it, that consciousness is like a stream, that it helps also, the consciousness helps in adjusting the individual with his environment. William James's works in the early 20th century were translated into Chinese and taught at the Chinese universities. That was before the revolution in China, before China became the People's Republic of China. The other influence on the Chinese psychology before 1949 was that of another prominent psychologist, particularly a prominent educational psychologist that you are also familiar with, who was also an American, by the name of John Dewey. आप जैसा स्क्रीन पे देख रहे हैं, he was considered an important educational psychologist. एक और शख्स जो कोलंबिया यूनिवर्सिटी से, अमेरिका में न्यूयॉर्क की कोलंबिया यूनिवर्सिटी से पढ़ के एक प्रोमिनेंट साइकोलॉजिस्ट जो थे, बाय द नेम ऑफ रैंडोल्फ सेलर, went over to before People's Republic of China became independent, and was lecturing in various universities in China. Saylor, after having lectured in China, and after the Chinese Communist Party took over control in China, in 1950, sailors came to Pakistan, because then the position and the nature of Chinese psychology had completely changed under the influence of the new regime. Therefore, the American influence receded, and Saylor came over to Pakistan. And Saylor taught at many universities, particularly in Lahore and Punjab, took courses in psychology here in Pakistan in the early 50s. Now, this was the condition before the revolution in China in 1949 of the nature of psychology. It was a functionalist psychology. It had the influence of the American way of thinking, and the American books and American periodicals were translated into Chinese and were taught. In 1950, after the revolution, a new trend had begun. Previously, there was the functionalist psychology. There was a stress on dynamic psychology. Do you remember what is dynamic psychology? Dynamic psychology is that part of psychology which looks into the unconscious motives, the hidden desires of the people that they consider are the main determinants of the psychology of a person. So, prior to the revolution in 1949, the American influence was predominant, particularly the functionalist and the dynamic psychology influence. After the revolution in 1950, the state, the Communist Party of China, recognized psychology as a separate science and a separate important subject, and wanted to provide facilities, open the ways for the Chinese psychologists to become more active, to be more actively engaged in Chinese life. As a result of that desire, China set up a commission in 1956, जैसा कि आप स्क्रीन पे भी देख रहे होंगे, to study what should be the nature of psychology in China, which reflects the Chinese reality and which is of use for the Chinese people in general. The commission in 1956 recommended that there should be 3 branches, or there should be 3 areas where the Chinese psychologists should concentrate their energies, where the state should facilitate the growth and development of Chinese psychology. And what were those 3 areas? The commission recommended that it should spend, by Chinese psychologists and Chinese resources should be spent more and more towards the establishment of, number 1, clinical psychology, number 2, psychology of work or psychology of labor, and number 3, educational psychology. आप जानते हैं clinical psychology क्या है? Clinical psychology, you know, is the use of psychological principles in a psychological clinic. So, one main area of interest and development in post-independence China was clinical psychology, where Chinese clinical psychologists began to research, started observing the nature of mental disease, the dynamics of mental disease, particularly 2 diseases which they found to be very prevalent in China. One of those was schizophrenia, and the other was manic depressive psychosis, or what we call depression. आप जानते हैं schizophrenia क्या चीज़ है? Schizophrenia को हम उर्दू में इंशिकाक ज़हनी कहते हैं, और schizophrenia आप जानते हैं one of the major or most prominent symptom in schizophrenia is hallucination, observation or perception without stimulation. आप ये भी जानते हैं schizophrenia means a split in personality. आप ये भी जानते हैं that schizophrenia, a patient suffering from schizophrenia is disconnected, disconnected emotionally from his social environment. So one of the major concerns of the Chinese psychologists was clinical psychology, and within clinical psychology, the area of schizophrenia. The other was, within clinical psychology, the area of manic depressive psychosis. ये 2 areas जो थे, इस पे clinical psychologist की तवज्जो थी. Manic depressive psychosis, जिसमें एक शख्स डिप्रेशन का शिकार है और फिर डिप्रेशन से खुद ब खुद निकल के वो बहुत ज़्यादा हाइपर हो जाता है, जिसको हम हाइपर एक्टिव कहते हैं, बहुत ज़्यादा तंदुरुस्त तवाना हो जाता है और वो बैठ नहीं सकता. ये दोनों बातें उसके कंट्रोल में नहीं होती. ही इज़ इन ए डिप्रेसिव फेज और ही passes on into a manic phase. So these are the 2 important areas that the clinical psychologists started to take a look at in the Chinese post-independence psychology in the area of clinical psychology. और चाइनीज साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स ने जो मेंटल डिजीज के इलाज के लिए तरीका इख्तियार किया, दैट दे कॉल्ड द स्पीडी सिंथेटिक मेथड. आप अपनी स्क्रीन पे भी देख रहे होंगे. स्पीडी सिंथेटिक मेथड was actually a combination of a number of methods put together. वो क्या मेथड्स हैं ट्रीटमेंट ऑफ मेंटल डिसऑर्डर्स के, आप बताइए मुझे, जरा ज़हन में लाइए, क्योंकि हमने काफ़ी डिटेल में उनके बारे में बात की है. वो मेथड्स आप जानते हैं, देयर आर टू कैटेगरीज ऑफ मेथड्स, द साइकोलॉजिकल मेथड्स एंड द साइकेट्रिक और बायोलॉजिकल मेथड्स. और साइकोलॉजिकल मेथड्स में हमने आपको एक लिस्ट दी थी ऑफ डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ मेथडोलॉजीज, and also we talked about the biological methods, and I outlined 3 methods for you. The Chinese, when they developed their methodology of treatment of mental disorder that they called speedy synthetic method, they merged many of these methods together. Wherever they felt that the patient required medication, they administered medicines. Wherever they felt that the patient required psychotherapy, then they gave him psychotherapy. It was not a method in the Freudian or psychodynamic sense that it would take years for a patient to recover. Their aim, the aim of the Chinese psychologists after 1949, was to develop a quick method of recovery. When we mix many methods of treatment together, it is called an eclectic approach to the treatment. And that is what the Chinese adopted. They called it the speedy synthetic method, which was a combination of a number of methodologies of treatment of mental disorder. This is the one area related to clinical psychology. The other area that the Chinese psychologists in the third world were looking at that time after 1949 was the psychology of work or psychology of labor. In that context, they put forward the view, they had agreed that mental labor as opposed to manual labor are two different things. They considered manual labor, physical labor, to be superior, and they devised ways and means of putting manual labor into the routines of people who were doing mental labor. यानी वो लोग जो पढ़ने लिखने का काम करते थे, वो लोग जो ऐसे काम करते हैं जो बैठ के किया जाता है, जिसमें सिर्फ ज़हन का इस्तेमाल शामिल है, उनके लिए चाइनीज़ माहिरीन ने ये तजवीज़ किया कि क्योंकि फिजिकल लेबर इज सुपीरियर, देयरफॉर those people who perform only mental labor should also perform manual labor. So they introduced the concept of manual labor becoming superior and introducing manual labor to those areas where manual labor was absent and where people only undertook mental labor. The third field that the Chinese psychologists looked into, if you remember, was the field of educational psychology. In educational psychology, the Chinese psychologists, number one, introduced manual labor in all educational institutions. जितने भी उनके तालीम के इदारे थे, उन्होंने उन तालीमी इदारों में फिजिकल और मैनुअल लेबर को कोर्स का हिस्सा बना दिया। स्टूडेंट्स को इस बात पे, ये स्टूडेंट्स के लिए, तमाम तलबा के लिए ये लाजिम था कि वो अपना कोर्स ख़त्म करने से पहले मैनुअल लेबर में हिस्सा लें, चाहे वो खेतों में हल चलाएं या नहरों की भल सफाई करें या बिल्डिंग्स की अपकीप में हिस्सा लें या सड़कें बनाने में हिस्सा लें या बिल्डिंग्स बनाने में हिस्सा लें। जो भी चीज़, whatever profession and activity required manual labor, all students, all educational institutions were required by the Chinese government to introduce manual labor as part of the educational curriculum. उनके सिलेबस का हिस्सा था। दूसरी बात जो चाइनीज एजुकेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट ने देखी वो ये थी कि बच्चों के लिए वो कौन सी उम्र है जिसमें बच्चों को स्कूल जाना जो है वो बेहतर है। हमारे यहाँ ख्याल किया जाता है कि 3 बरस या 4 बरस की उम्र में बच्चा स्कूल जाना शुरू कर दे। अमेरिका में आमतौर पर 6 बरस के बच्चे को स्कूल में भेजा जाता है, यूरोप में भी ऐसा ही है। लेकिन चाइनीज़ एजुकेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स ने ये तय किया अपने हालात के मुताबिक कि वो कौन सा मुनासिब वक्त है जब बच्चों को स्कूल में जाना चाहिए और वो कौन से स्कूल के दौरान, उनके क्लासेस के दौरान वो कौन सा अरसा है जिसमें चाइनीज़ साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स और टीचर्स को मखसूस सब्जेक्ट्स बच्चों को पढ़ाने चाहिए। मसलन ये कि पहली क्लास में क्या पढ़ाना जाना चाहिए, दूसरी में क्या, तीसरी में क्या, वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह। तो ये 3 चीज़ें चाइनीज़ साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स ने इंट्रोड्यूस की आफ्टर they gained independence in 1949. That is, they looked into the clinical psychology, developed their own methodology of diagnostics, developed their own methodology of treatment. The treatment methodology they called, I just gave you the name, speedy synthetic method. The other area that they looked into was the area of psychology of labor or work, where they regarded manual labor, physical labor to be superior, and introduced manual labor in all fields of life. And the third area that they looked into was educational psychology, introduced manual labor into all educational institutions, and found out what were the best ages for children to begin schooling, and what were the best ages for children to begin studying certain subjects. These were the main features of Chinese psychology or psychology in China after their revolution in 1949, and this is another contribution of the third world country psychologists to the development of psychology. Let us take a look at another third world country, that is our own country, Pakistan. You know that Pakistan gained its independence from the colonial powers in 1947. हमारी जंग आज़ादी जो मुस्लिम लीग की स्प्लिट के बाद, कांग्रेस से स्प्लिट के बाद मुस्लिम लीग बनने के बाद जो शुरू हुई, उसकी इंतहा थी 1947 में, जबकि पाकिस्तान मारज़े वजूद में आया। जब पाकिस्तान बना उस वक्त पाकिस्तान के, आप जानते हैं, 2 हिस्से थे, मशरकी पाकिस्तान, ईस्ट पाकिस्तान, एंड वेस्ट पाकिस्तान और मगरबी पाकिस्तान, 2 हिस्से थे। उस वक्त मगरबी और मशरकी पाकिस्तान में मिलाकर 2 जगह पर सिर्फ पोस्ट ग्रेजुएट डिग्रीज ऑफर की जाती थी। वन एट ढाका यूनिवर्सिटी, that was East Pakistan at that time, and the other at Government College Lahore, which was affiliated to the Punjab University. These were the 2 places where postgraduate degrees in psychology were offered, But in both these departments, Dhaka University and Government College, which was affiliated to Punjab University, the degrees that were awarded in psychology, the degrees were awarded in psychology, but the departments were under the influence of or under the administrative control of philosophy departments. So there was an influence of philosophy on psychology when independence took place and when Pakistan became an independent country in 1947. After 1947, many universities were set up. One at Rajshahi in East Pakistan, it was East Pakistan at that time, and then another one at Peshawar University, another one called Karachi University, another one was established at the University of Punjab, an independent department. All of these departments then appeared in the decades of the late 50s to the late 60s. इन 10 बरसों के दौरान ये बहुत से डिपार्टमेंट पाकिस्तान में खोले गए जिनमें पोस्ट ग्रेजुएट मास्टर्स डिग्री इन साइकोलॉजी वाज ऑफर्ड. Rajshahi and Dhaka in Bangladesh, and then Government College, then Peshawar University, then Karachi University, and then Punjab University. Not necessarily in that order, but all of these universities and educational institutions started offering master's level degrees in psychology. The main thrust of psychology in these institutions was on psychodynamics, the psychology of psychodynamics, which is, as you remember, the main thrust was on Freudian and Jungian approaches. आप जानते हैं Freudian approach क्या है और ये भी जानते हैं कि Jungian approach क्या है. इन यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में ज़्यादातर फ्रॉयडियन और यूंगियन साइकोलॉजी का ही बोलबाला था, इन्हीं की ज़्यादा अप्रोच को पढ़ाया जाता था. दूसरी चीज़ जो इन डिपार्टमेंट्स में पढ़ाई जाती थी वो दैट वाज सोशल साइकोलॉजी. फॉर इंस्टेंस द यूनिवर्सिटी एट राजशाही वाज हेडेड by somebody who had a degree in social psychology. So the main thrust of Rajshahi University was towards social psychology. Then the University of Karachi was headed by someone who had a specialization in clinical psychology. So the University of Karachi's specialization was in the area of clinical psychology. Then the institution that was set up in the Punjab offered courses in experimental psychology, general psychology, related also to animal experimentation and psychological measurement. तो ये 3-4 हिस्से थे, 3-4 चीज़ें थी जिनमें psychology flourished in the late 50s up to the late 60s in the areas of psychodynamics, social psychology, experimental and general psychology, measurement and clinical psychology. Then in 1971, you know that Pakistan broke up and East Pakistan became Bangladesh and West Pakistan became Pakistan. After 1971, another institution was set up at Islamabad called the National Institute of Psychology, or NIP for short. NIP stands for National Institute of Psychology, where no classes were taking place in the beginning. The main thrust of NIP at the time of its establishment was to conduct research and then to conduct post-graduate or research which would lead to doctoral degrees. And that was in the early 70s. Later, NIP, or National Institute of Psychology, was merged into the Islamabad University. It is these days a part of the Islamabad University, and it has its specialization in the areas of developmental psychology, forensic psychology, psychological measurement, and other related areas. Now, graduates from these institutions that we have named in Pakistan, that is the Government College, then the Punjab University, then the Karachi University, then the Peshawar University, and then National Institute of Psychology at Islamabad University. They are performing most significant functions in the development of our national character and in the development of our national economy. हमारे इन इंस्टीट्यूशन से जो ग्रेजुएट्स हैं, मैं समझता हूं कि उनके लिए सबसे ज़्यादा नौकरी के जो मौके हैं वो मौजूद हैं. The graduates from these institutions are employed. Let's review the places where they are employed. Number one, in the armed forces. All services, Navy, Air Force, and the Pakistan Army employs trained psychologists who are used for selection of officers and selections of non-officers in the armed forces. So that is one main area where the graduates from institutions of Pakistan are absorbed, the armed forces. Another area, of course, is the education department. Practically all colleges all over the country offer courses in psychology, so there are tremendous opportunities, and a lot of graduates that come out of these institutions that I have recounted go into the education department all over the country. Then there are the public service commissions. You know, there are public service commissions at the provincial level, and then there is the public service commission at the national level. All these public service commissions at the provincial and the national level employ psychologists who help the process of selection of officers who are supposed to serve in the public sector areas. So that's another source where the graduates coming out of those universities are employed, in the public service commissions. Then, of course, the psychologists who graduate from these places are also employed by the labor department and then by the social welfare departments. All provinces have their independent labor departments, and then all these people who graduate from these places are then employed in various labor departments. Then, of course, this was a list of some of the areas where graduates get absorbed after having graduated from their respective universities. This was the public sector. Then, of course, graduates are employed also in the private sector, such as in the areas of research, such as in the areas of advertising, measurement of advertising, effectiveness, such as in the areas of consumer research, such as in the area of consumer behavior research. So there is a lot of scope for psychologists apart from the public sectors into the private sector also. Now, of course, you know that many private sector universities are emerging all over Pakistan. They are recognized by HEC, they are recognized by the local provincial governments, and their degrees are accepted by the provinces as well as the federal government. So a lot of private sector universities are also offering courses in psychology, and many people are graduating from these places and are being absorbed in the market. So this is the state of psychology. Before I end the state of psychology in Pakistan, a mention also must be made of the professional association of psychologists. There is a professional association of psychologists called the Pakistan Psychological Association, or PPA for short. PPA has its own body that is elected by the members of the PPA, or Pakistan Psychological Association. Anyone who is a graduate, which is of course holding a master's degree, a minimum of master's degree from an educational institution, either from Pakistan or from abroad, can become a member of the Pakistan Psychological Association, and then he or she is entitled to vote for the office bearers or the governing body of Pakistan Psychological Association. The main function that the Pakistan Psychological Association holds are seminars, workshops, and annual meetings. Pakistan Psychological Association also publishes the papers that are presented in their sessions, and it is an important body of professional psychologists in Pakistan. This is the state of psychology in Pakistan until today, one of the third world countries. Before we end today's lecture, let us review what we had talked about. We talked about 2 third world countries today. You remember third world countries, or तीसरी दुनिया वो है who became independent or became autonomous after the Second World War. One important third world country that we talked about was China, which is known as People's Republic of China. We talked about the state of psychology in China in 2 periods, in relationship to 2 periods, one before the Chinese Revolution in 1949 and the other after the Chinese Revolution in 1949. I related to you that before the Chinese Revolution, when the Communist Party of China took over the control of Chinese state, China was under the influence, at least academically, of the American psychologists. Many American psychological books had been translated into Chinese language, and they were taught at the university and the college level. And there were 2 important American psychologists who were the main people who were considered as the great or the prominent psychologists that the Chinese followed. One was William James, and you know William James's psychology was the functionalist psychology. And the other was, you remember, the other prominent American psychologist, John Dewey, and his main thrust was the principle of the application of psychological principles to education. These were the 2 main influences on the Chinese psychology, which were American influences on Chinese psychology. After the revolution in 1949, the Chinese set up their own commission, and the commission looked into what is required by the Chinese circumstances and Chinese conditions, and they came to the conclusion, the commission recommended, that Chinese psychologists must look into 3 areas. 1, clinical psychology, 2, psychology of labor, and 3, psychology of educational psychology. And the Chinese psychologists, after the revolution, developed their own methodologies related to the first area, that is clinical psychology. They looked into schizophrenia, they looked into manic depressive psychosis, and they developed their own methodology of treatment. Their methodology of treatment, if you remember, was speedy synthetic method. You remember, I told you speedy synthetic method is actually a combination of many approaches to the treatment of mental disorders, and only those options were adopted by the Chinese clinical psychologists which produced quick results. So that was one area where Chinese psychologists looked into, the clinical psychology part of it, and they looked into schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis, developing their own technology of treatment of these mental disorders called speedy synthetic method. The other area that the Chinese psychologists looked into was psychology of labor or psychology of work. They regarded manual labor to be superior and introduced manual labor in most fields of human development and most fields of human functioning. The third area that they looked into was what I described to you as educational psychology, and their main thrust was to discover which is the best age for children to go to school and which is the best age for children to study certain subjects that they need to study. These were the main features of the Chinese psychology after the revolution. The other psychology that we looked at in the third world countries was related to Pakistan. In Pakistan's context, I pointed out to you the history, brief history and prominent features of Pakistani psychology before 1971. Why do I say before 1971? Because at that time, East and West Pakistan were one country, and we were talking about certain universities and courses that were offered in East Pakistan, such as Dhaka and Rajshahi University. And after 1971, when Bangladesh became, when East Pakistan became Bangladesh, West Pakistan called itself only Pakistan, and we talked about different types of degrees offered and different types of educational institutions that existed and that cropped up in West Pakistan or Pakistan, and that related to the departments in the Government College Lahore, the departments of Punjab University, the departments of Karachi University, the department of Peshawar University, and other departments in the autonomous colleges and in the private sector. I pointed out to you that these departments offered courses related to psychodynamics, social psychology, clinical psychology, experimental and general psychology, and psychological measurement. I also mentioned to you that in the 70s, the National Institute of Psychology was established, which later became part of the Islamabad University. And this is how the condition of psychology today stands in Pakistan, one of the third world countries. उम्मीद है आपको ये बातें, तीसरी दुनिया से मुतल्लिक, नफ्सियात से मुतल्लिक बातें अच्छी तरह से ज़हन नशीन हो गई होंगी. We'll talk about some recently developed areas of psychology in the next lecture. Until then, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.